The chandelier swayed, though no wind touched it. A man's voice cracked from the corner. "Tell him the truth, Richard, or I will." The dinner guests froze, forks hovering, wine trembling in crystal glasses. Michael's small hand tugged at his father's sleeve, eyes wide with fear. Across the table, Henry's smile stretched too thin, hiding rot beneath. The air felt like glass about to shatter, every secret balancing on its edge. Watch until the end to see how this incredible story unfolds, and let us know what time you're watching today. The cabin smelled of coffee and recycled air, a thin warm breath that made Michael's skin crawl. He sat by the window, fingers tracing the cool seam of the plastic armrest as if the pattern could steady him. Outside, the tarmac shone under a weak white sun, a shimmer of heat and metal. Inside, voices rose and fell like waves. Every small sound landed on him as if it were a stone thrown into a glass bowl. Richard watched him from the aisle seat, one hand on a leather briefcase, the other hovering between the seat and Michael's shoulder. Richard's face was practiced calm. Years of negotiations and contracts had taught him how to shape his expression. He had spent a fortune to make this flight comfortable. An extra seat, so Michael could stretch, a quiet toy tucked into his carry-on, noise-canceling headphones that sat like a crown beside Michael's head. Still, Richard's jaw tightened now and then. He was used to controlling outcomes. He was not used to feeling small in the face of his son's distress. Michael's eyes moved in precise, slow circles. He was 15, but he carried himself with a child's uncertain gait and a scholar's distant stare. His hair was almost black, cut straight across like a soft curtain. He watched the flight attendant walk down the aisle with the calm focus of someone who cataloged human movement for a living, the way a bird tilts its head, the rhythm of another person's hands. To him, every motion held meaning. To Richard, every look was a measure of risk. There was a thin notebook open on Michael's lap. He did not write with a pen so much as he mapped his world in small pictograms and shorthand. A box for airplanes, a circle for clouds, a jagged line for the noise he feared. In the corner of the page, he had drawn a tiny house with 3 windows and a tree. That house was always the same. It was where he imagined safety lived. A child a few rows ahead laughed loudly, a single clear sound that split the cabin air and lodged itself under Michael's skin. He flinched, hands tightening on the notebook until the pages bent. He put the little headphones on, but the world still arrived. The clink of a cup, the whisper of a shoe, the murmur of seatbelts clicking. The small lights above flickered as the crew checked the cabin. For most people, these were background details, soft punctuation in a traveling sentence. For Michael, they were front and center events, each a new line he had to process. Richard knelt, trying to make his voice normal, and even, "Michael, try the headphones. Look at this picture. Remember the house." Michael did not look up. He did not refuse on purpose. Rejection was not his style. He simply moved like someone who needed more time than the rest of the world allowed. His breath came in measured pulls. When he spoke, his voice was the rarest thing, a small, clear bell. Plain, he said. The single word held fear and a strange, unwavering curiosity. Richard's hand brushed Michael's knee. He had chosen this flight for a reason. There was a ceremony in London, a ribbon cutting for a hospital wing that Richard had funded. Cameras would be there. Donors would applaud. The paper would print Richard's name in silver letters. He had believed he could manage everything, the press, the speeches, the care. He had not planned for the way Michael's body could go loud when quiet was required. Around them, life settled into its practiced rituals. A woman in a red scarf snapped a photo, a man in a suit read a glossy magazine, and children played invisible games. The cabin was a small city moving through the sky, each person wrapped in their own weather. Michael's weather was a rain that refused to stop. Richard watched the boy with a father's worry and a father's fierce love. He remembered Michael's first day at school, the way the boy had clung to his coat and refused the hand extended by a teacher named Claire. He remembered first diagnoses, late-night searches for therapies and specialists, the ledger of expensive treatments that had stacked like trophies across his life. Money had opened doors, yes, Private tutors, sensory rooms behind closed doors, but money could not change what the world felt like to Michael: rough edges, loud lights, voices that moved too quickly. A flight attendant came near, with a tray of drinks, apron white against the blue of the uniform. She leaned, smiled a practiced smile, and asked in a voice she reserved for sleepwalking passengers, "Anything for you, sir?" Richard forced a smile. "Water, please." Michael's lips trembled. He wanted to move away from the sound of voices. He wanted to make the whole place smaller and softer and safe. He folded himself inward like a coin. Outside, the plane's engine gave a small, steady rumble that felt like a distant drum. Michael closed his eyes and counted. Counting helped him name the chaos. He counted clouds, windows, tray tables, anything that would turn noise into numbers and numbers into order. He whispered each number under his breath, like a private prayer. Richard let him count. He watched the numbers form a ladder that did not climb past the first few rungs, as if he could reach for more with his hand and fail. He wanted to tell Michael that everything would be all right. He wanted to tell him that the ceremony was important, that good things awaited, that cameras would nod and the world would respect him. But words were brittle here. He swallowed them like pills. A small boy, maybe 8, ran down the aisle with a paper airplane. He squealed with the kind of joy that cuts two ways, bright and dangerous in the same breath. The plane clipped the light above Michael like a tiny comet. Michael's hands flew to his ears. The sound punched him in a place where pain and memory lived together. For a breath, the world narrowed to the roar inside his head. He screamed. It was not the scream of a tantrum. It was a visceral cry that carried more of surprise and fear than anger. The cabin turned. 1,000 eyes sharpened toward them. Richard felt his stomach drop as if he had been pushed off a tall building. The briefcase thumped against his knee. Richard moved first. He leaned over Michael, bending like a reed to shelter him. His voice was low, edged with a command that did not belong in air travel. "Michael, look at me. Breathe with me. Count me." Michael's breath hitched, a small, uneven sound. He tried to make his mouth obey, to count. He could not find the ladder of numbers. He clutched at the notebook, at the tiny drawn house, as if it were an anchor in a storm. Around them, whispers began. The woman in the red scarf covered her mouth, eyes wide. The man with the magazine snapped it shut. 2 rows back, a mother shielded her child with a hand. A steward turned toward them, expression blank at first, then sharpening into procedure. Richard felt a heat rise behind his ribs, shame, anger, fear braided into one. He had always tried to avoid scenes. He had paid for privacy and got his son's routines into predictable patterns. Now the world watched. He felt small, and the smallness frightened him more than anything else. A hand, dark-skinned, small and steady, slid into view just beneath Michael's elbow. It belonged to a boy in the row behind, someone Richard had not seen until now. The boy's face was open and calm. He had a softness to him that belonged to people who had learned to move through the world without demanding a change for them. He did not look shocked. He only looked present. "Sir," the boy said, quietly, not to Richard, not to the crew, but to Michael. His voice did not try to smooth anything over. It was simply there like a bridge. Michael blinked. He had not noticed the hand. He looked at the dark skin, at the small fingers, at the knuckles that had scraped dirt and still shone with a kind of cleanness. The scream thinned, replaced by something like attention. Richard found his mouth open and closed it. He did not know this boy. The thought of strangers touching his son made him bristle. He straightened, intent on moving the boy away. But the boy, Marcus, if the name could be felt in the room like a scent, only let his fingers rest against Michael's forearm. It was not a grip. It was a grounding. It was a message without words. Outside the plane, the world waited. Engine staff, the day beyond the windows. Inside, a small, fragile thing had shifted. Michael's breathing evened, a hairline change, but a change all the same. Richard watched as if a miracle had been paid out in slow motion. He did not yet know whether to be angry at the stranger or thankful. The steward, professional, careful, approached with a smile that was steady in a practiced way. He asked if everything was all right. Richard answered in a way that tried to hold every meaning at once. "We're fine," he said. The words were both true and not true. Michael closed his notebook and rested his head against the window. He watched the world outside as if mapping a new route. Marcus, small, dark, plain-haired, sat back in his seat as if he had done nothing at all. Yet, in that small act, he had shifted the shape of the moment. It was not yet a story. It was only a single, quiet rescue. Richard's chest kept a steady beat. He did not see cameras yet. He did not see the press or the applause. He only saw his son, who had returned from a place he could not name, and a stranger whose touch had reminded him of a shore. He did not know, in that instant, that this was the first bend in a river that would change the map of his life. He did not know that one small act would ripple outward like a stone into deep water. He only knew the small, fierce fact of now. Michael had stopped screaming. The airport smelled different than the plane, cleaner, colder, as if the day had been iron flat. Richard carried Michael through a tunnel of moving walkways and glass, the city stretching beyond like a promise he wanted to keep. Cameras waited near the ceremony, men and women with polished smiles and questions that wanted easy answers. Richard kept one hand on Michael's shoulder, the other on his phone, already scanning the messages he knew would demand him. Michael held his small notebook like a talisman. The little house with 3 windows was still drawn in the corner, but the page beneath it had a fresh, empty space. He watched people with eyes that cataloged detail, breathing slowly, safe for the moment. For Richard, the moment felt fragile. He remembered the way Marcus's hand had steadied his son on the plane. He kept that memory folded in the same part of his chest where he kept gratitude and worry. They were almost at the arrival's hall when a woman in a gray blazer stepped out from the shadows near the press barriers. She was thin and quick-eyed, carrying a tablet and an expression that suggested she lived by schedules and secrets both. Her name was Laura, Richard's public relations manager, and she had the hard, practiced kindness of someone who smooths edges for a living. "Mr. Carrington," she said, using his family name like a coin, "we're ready for you in 40 minutes. A few cameras want a line. The mayor will be there." Richard nodded. "Thank you, Laura. Michael is with me." Laura's eyes flicked to the boy. "Of course." Her smile did not change. It was a smile that had saved him more than once. She directed them to a private lounge meant to hold the family until the applause began. The lounge was quiet, a small island of leather and glass. Richard sank into a chair and let the noise of the building wash past. He breathed for the first time in hours. Michael sat on the sofa, head bowed, fingers moving across the notebook's margin as if retracing a safe path. Laura set a glass of water on the table, then hesitated. She looked at Richard with a measure of something he did not like, the look people gave when they had news they felt the need to deliver slowly. "There's a package," she said. "It was left with security. No return address." Richard's heart moved like a bird in a cage. Packages to him meant gifts, checks, invitations. They also meant trouble sometimes, letters reminding him of debts or people he'd preferred to forget. He folded his hand over Michael's knee. "Bring it." She rose and returned within a minute with a thin envelope, the kind that could hide a photograph or a short note. The seal had been opened, the flap tucked in like a small white mouth. Richard's fingers, used to signing documents and handling fragile deals, felt suddenly clumsy as he slit the envelope all the way. Inside lay a Polaroid. It was a simple picture, Michael and Marcus on the plane. Michael's face was turned toward the window, eyes distant. Marcus was in the background, hand resting near Michael's arm. The image was small and ordinary. Snapshots are ordinary things, but something about the way it had been taken, the angle and timing, made it feel like evidence. Beneath the photograph, someone had written in heavy, hurried letters, "He notices. Keep him quiet." Richard felt the room tilt. The words did not make sense at first, then a coldness imprinted itself on his skin. Who had taken the photo? Who had come so close to his son? Why a message like that? "Laura," he said, voice thin. "Who sent this?" Laura's jaw tightened. Security says no one saw. Cameras in the corridor were turned off for maintenance. She put her fingers against her temple, like she might press something loose back into place. I can call the police. No, the word was quick and sharp. He would handle this. He always handled things. He sat up straighter than he felt. Not yet. Michael looked up at the picture as if it were a new page of his life. He could not read the words, but he read faces. Marcus's face in the photo looked calm, almost as if he had been waiting. Michael's fingers closed around his notebook. The empty space on the page felt heavier now, like a missing piece. A different thought rose in Richard's chest like a slow tide. Blackmail. Someone who knew the picture could make trouble. Someone who knew how to press a man like him. A man at his level lived with knives hidden under velvet, business partners, donors, rivals. But who would threaten Michael? The boy meant everything to him. Laura was already typing on her tablet, moving through contacts. There are voices online, she said. A few forums. Someone posted a comment about the boy and the stranger. I've pulled the feeds. It's small, but it could grow. Richard's face emptied of color. The world had a way of turning things into spectacles, and the more public his life grew, the more dangerous the glare. He had built his life on careful moves. This felt like a misstep he could not erase. He had other thoughts, too, smaller, angrier ones that tasted of blame. Why had a stranger been so close to his son? Why had his privacy been invaded? Richard's suspicion flicked like a jointed shadow. Marcus, that quiet boy with dark skin, had become a focal point in his head. He thought of class, of appearances, of the neat lines he had always kept between his life and people like Marcus. He wondered, without wanting to, whether Marcus had been more than a helper on the plane. Why would a poor boy be in such a place? Why would he even carry a camera? Marcus was not in the airport lounge. No one had seen him leave, and the Polaroid showed him looking too calm to be a spy or thief. The confusion made Richard restless. He wanted answers and he wanted control. He wanted the picture to go bad. Outside the glass wall, the city breathed unaware. Inside the lounge, Richard felt his decisions narrowing like a hallway. He could call the police and draw a public line, or he could keep the matter private and cut at the root. He had influence, lawyers, favors stacked like cards. He had built a machine that rarely broke, but sometimes machines betrayed their makers. Richard stood up, saying he would go to the ceremony. His voice held a steadiness that was partly practiced and partly brittle truth. We'll get through this, he told Michael. He could not decide whether he was speaking to his son or to himself. As they left the lounge, Michael's hand slid into Richard's. Richard did not look down. He could not let the tremor in his hand show. Michael's fingers were warm and small and trusting. Richard wrapped his fingers around his son's palm and felt a promise there he had never given to paper. I will protect you. He did not know, in that moment, that another hand had been watching them from a distance. Henry, Richard's oldest friend and partner, had lingered near a bank of elevators. Henry's face was close, a mask of concern. Henry was a man who had done favors in the dark and expected them returned under light. He watched Richard take the Polaroid from Laura's hand, watched the way Richard tucked it into his suit pocket where it pressed flat beside his heart. Henry pushed back from the elevator and walked the opposite way. His phone buzzed, and he answered with quick, small words. He took it. Came the voice on the other side. Henry's answer was a breath, a promise wrapped in a lie. I'll handle him, he said. Don't worry. Beneath the civil surface of the day, something had begun to unspool. A photograph, a scratched message, a missing page, a boy who had touched a frightened hand. Simple things, but the sort of small threads that could pull the whole seam apart. Richard felt the weight of choices lined up in his mind. Loyalty and image and the raw love for a son tangled with fear and old debts. He had always believed in the currency of control. He did not know yet who would betray him or why. He only knew that a new shape had arrived in his life, one that would not be smoothed with a signature or a check. He walked into the bright corridor toward the ceremony, Michael at his side, and the photograph burned like a secret he could not drop. Richard moved through the days that followed with the exactness of someone who measured life in appointments and returns. He stood at podiums and smiled at cameras, his suit immaculate, his words practiced. Yet, after each speech, he retreated to quiet rooms and checked his phone the way a man checks a wound. The Polaroid sat folded in his wallet like a burned paper. He took it out sometimes and watched Marcus's steady face, the way his hand rested near Michael's arm. He told himself it was precaution. He told himself he was protecting his son. At home, the house seemed too big and too silent. Its rooms were cleaned into geometry, furniture arranged like pieces on a chessboard. Michael moved through it like someone visiting a museum where every object had rules. He liked the kitchen in the morning light because the tile was cool and constant. He liked to line up the cereal boxes by height and make small piles of the same colored things. Richard watched these lists and rituals the way he watched balance sheets, safe when they added up. There were other things that did not add up. Henry came to dinner with a laugh that did not touch his eyes. He praised Richard's charity work and asked after Michael in a way that suggested a man who had practiced concern. But when Henry's hand brushed Richard's shoulder in the evening and his smile fell into something quick and private, Richard noticed. He could not always name the feeling. Sometimes it was annoying. How long had Henry been playing with friendship? Sometimes it was a thin, sharp fear that someone near him would trade loyalty for a ledger entry. Laura was a kind of anchor in the swinging world. She moved through the company like someone who could fold storms into neat statements. She had arranged the press and smoothed the way for donors. She sat with Richard in the quiet hours, hands folded, and told him what the headlines would be. She also watched the edges that Richard sometimes failed to see. Small mentions online, a commentary that threaded its way into a forum, an anonymous email asking if his son was safe because of the company's donors. Laura's face sometimes grew distant when she thought about the photograph. She had spent years protecting reputations. She also knew how fragile reputations could be when someone pulled at the wrong thread. Marcus, meanwhile, lived in a different geometry of life. He worked part-time at a small phone shop not far from the train station. He kept his hair short and his clothes clean, and he had learned the language of waiting, how to stand and not be noticed, how to smile when needed. After the flight, he had gone back to his corner of the city and felt something inside him loosen and then tighten again. He had not meant to become a part of a rich man's story. He had only done what felt right in the airplane when the boy screamed. Touching Michael had been simple. It had been a thing he could do for someone, like handing over a sweater to a friend who was cold. But Marcus also carried his own small, private history. His mother had worked at the market and taken shifts that left Marcus watching the house in the dark. He had learned to move between people and not let himself take up more space than he needed. He knew what it was to be seen briefly and then forgotten. The photograph made him uneasy because it showed him doing the one thing he did without thinking, and now it had been framed as evidence. When Marcus went home that evening, his sister, Anna, asked him what he had for dinner and whether he had met any new people. Anna's eyes were bright and immediate. She lived in the present like someone who treasured every second. Marcus told her that he had helped a boy on a plane. He left out the photograph. He left out the way a man in a suit had clenched his jaw and looked at him like a riddle. He said only it was nothing, and Anna smiled like she believed him. Sometimes belief is a gift. At the office, Laura set meetings with PR teams and lawyers. She instructed silence where possible and suggested a careful statement, gratitude for concern, request for privacy, and an appeal to human decency. Her fingers hovered over the draft. She did not like secrecy. She did not like how easily one small image had the power to reshape a day. Yet she also felt the pressure of something else, a subtle shift in Henry's tone when he called from the company's offices. Henry said nothing overt, but Laura felt it, an assumption that some things were negotiable. She had grown up with the idea that loyalty could be counted and counted on, and she had learned the hard way that loyalties were sometimes like coins that change hands. Richard watched Marcus through the lens of suspicion and the softer lens of gratitude, alternating like a fault line. He could not help it. He loved Michael with a kind of ferocity that made him blind at times. He thought of the possibilities, someone taking pictures for profit, someone planting a story to unsettle him, someone trying to embarrass him. He thought of Henry's small phrase on the phone, "I'll handle him." The words repeated in his head, like a puzzle piece that had not found its place. Was Henry promising help, or was he promising something darker? At night, Richard dreamed in fragments. He dreamt of security doors left open, of cameras that blinked like sleeping eyes, and of a photograph that kept flipping upside down in his hands. He woke with his stomach in knots and called Laura before the sun fully rose. She answered with measured calm, and together they began to move with a strategy that had served them well in many other storms. They would not go to the police, not yet. They would find the origin. They would control the narrative. Michael, for his part, found refuge in routines. He liked to draw the house with 3 windows and the same tree outside. He would trace the pattern until the lines smoothed into a path. Sometimes he asked in brief sentences if Marcus would come back. He could not say why he cared so much. He only knew that the hand had been steady and warm and that the world had grown less loud for a minute because of it. Richard answered carefully, promising things he thought would comfort, and sometimes things he did not mean to say aloud. He would say, "People help each other sometimes." The house became a place of small negotiations. Anna called sometimes to ask after Marcus, as if he wore a worry she wanted to lift. Henry visited with a smile that did not fully reach him. Laura sent updates about the press and suggested gentle boundaries. Richard answered each interaction with the kind of measured voice he used in meetings, but beneath that voice was a restlessness that grew like ivy. He began to tally favors he had paid and favors owed, to measure the world by the debt and credit of human acts. In the middle of all this was a single photograph and a single act of kindness. It pulled at people like threads, some tugged forward with compassion, some with calculation. None of them yet knew the scale of what had been set into motion. They moved like chess pieces on a board they believed they controlled, and some of them were already playing a deeper game than they admitted to themselves. The small tensions, pride, fear, debt, gratitude, were beginning to knot together into something that would not be undone by statements and smiles. Laura's screen glowed in the dark of Richard's study like a small, accusing moon. She had come that night with a folder and eyes that moved too fast for comfort. The house around them breathed with the soft noise of late lamps and the distant traffic like a river. Michael slept in the room above, the soft light under his door like a promise. "Look at this," Laura said, and her finger tapped a line of numbers and an email address. The numbers were a wire transfer, small, hidden in a stack of legitimate payments, but the sender name made Laura's jaw go hard. Henry Caldwell. Richard felt the world tilt. He had known Henry for 20 years. Henry had stood with him at bad board meetings and at weddings. He had been family in all the ways that business could make a man family. To see his name linked made the paper in Laura's hand feel suddenly hot. "What is it?" Richard asked, but his voice was already softer than he meant. Laura kept tapping. "A payment to a freelance photographer. A small amount. 2 days before the flight. And there's another courier service, same time. Then an email from a burner account with photos attached. The courier name matches the drop-off point at the airport security desk." Richard's blood ran in his ears. It was a map, simple, sharp, impossible to ignore. A wire, a courier, a photo. The quiet of the study seemed full of 1,000 small footsteps. Why would Henry? He could not finish. Because he set it up, Laura said. He arranged for the Polaroid to appear. He paid for it and used a courier. He left no return address because he wanted it anonymous. No one had yet told him why. The space left by that reason yawned wide and dizzy. Richard drove to the office that night. Henry's building was lit like a ship. He felt the engine of his car vibrate as if it knew what it meant to be driven fast. He walked into Henry's office without a knock. Henry sat behind a neat desk, papers stacked like small white mountains. He looked up with a smile that did not hide the cold. "Richard," Henry said, "you should not be here at this hour. Why did you do it?" Richard asked, the words coming thin and hard. "Why did you pay someone to take a photo of my son? Why did you leave it where Laura could find it?" Henry steepled his fingers, an old habit when he wanted to play calm. "It was a nudge, Richard, a nudge to wake you up." "To wake me up?" Richard's laugh was ugly and short. "You used my son as a nudge. You are not listening." Henry's voice did not rise. It sliced. "You have been floating away. You hand out checks and names and goodwill. You let people tell you what the next chapter is. You were not here, Richard. Your boy needed more than your money. He needed you." Richard felt something break in his chest, a small, thin sound like glass. The words were meant to wound and to justify all at once. Henry had always had a way of wrapping the sharp in a velvet sentence. "You saw Marcus," Henry said, leaning back like a man who enjoyed revealing a trick. "He was a convenient actor. A hand on a shoulder. You reacted exactly as we predicted. You reached into your wallet. You wanted to erase the paper. You wanted control. I would never allow—" Richard stopped because he could not breathe the rest of it. "You used a child." Henry's mouth tightened. "I used a tool. Not a child. A tool. Your life is a company now, Richard. Your son is a headline. If you do not control the narrative, others will." "You planned this to manipulate me," Richard said. He was suddenly very cold, as if all the heat in the room had fled. "Why? For what?" Henry's eyes were small and clear. He reached into his drawer and produced a small file, contracts threaded with numbers and signatures. He slid it across the desk like an offering. "We can merge with Marlowe Holdings," he said quietly. "It's the next step. There are investors who want certainty. They want you less distracted. They want a single leader. If you step back, if you make public moves, controlled moves, then we can secure the deal. If you do not, someone else will force the issue and the company will fracture. I am trying to save what you built." The offer sat like a cold stone. Richard thought of years, of sweat and deals, of nights that had emptied his energy and filled a bank account. A merger meant power, yes, but also the loss of control. It meant Henry was closer to the wheel. "You put my son at risk for a business maneuver," Richard said. Rage and grief braided in his chest. It was not just business now. It was personal and raw. "You photographed my child, left it like a threat, and expected me to step where you wanted." Henry's face shifted. For a moment, something like regret crossed, and then it hardened. "I wanted to scare you into attention, not into ruin. Business is cruel. You know that. I made a decision that you might call ugly. But you owe me, Richard. You owe us both, people who stood by you. This could secure your legacy. You will not like the method, but the outcome is what matters." Richard saw the edge of the betrayal then. It was not only that Henry had used a photograph, it was that Henry believed he could bargain with Richard's life the way he bargained with assets, numbers on a page. "You always thought like that," Richard said. The words were small, and they carried the load of years. "You sign things and forget the lives inside them." Henry stood, close and too familiar. "I am practical," he said. "You are sentimental. That is why I make the hard choices." Outside, the city pulsed like a heart. Inside, Richard felt the walls press inward. He did not know whether to laugh or cry. The man who had once been his brother-in-law had shown a hand that wanted to take everything from him, his company, his control, even his boy's safety. "You will not blackmail me with my son," Richard said. The words were measured, a blade. He could feel the old, unbending man he had been, the one who closed deals and never let his hand shake. That man wanted to strike. Henry smiled then, but it was thin. "I did not plan for you to find out this way. I thought you would be grateful. I thought you would be relieved and make the right move." "You thought I would be grateful?" Richard felt dizzy. For what? For being manipulated into a deal that makes you richer? Henry shrugged like a man who felt his logic undeniable. "I did it for the company, Richard. For our future." The betrayal settled into Richard's ribs like ice. It changed the shape of everything he had believed about Henry. It made him question the deals, the dinners, the nights when Henry had given counsel. How many other small catastrophes had Henry started in the name of the company? How many lives had been moved as pawns? Richard left Henry's office with his hands empty and his head full of a new kind of noise. He had been betrayed by a man he trusted, and that betrayal cut two ways through the architecture of his business and into the soft center where Michael lived. He wanted to protect his son, to make all of it, every ugly, deliberate choice stop. But there was another turn he had not yet seen. Henry had said he handled him. He had made a payment. He had orchestrated the Polaroid. That meant Marcus had been used. Marcus, who had simply reached out his hand on a plane. Marcus, who did not know the machinery his small act had unleashed. Richard's mind ran ahead like a hawk searching for prey. He thought of Marcus sitting in a small shop, of Anna waiting at home. He thought of money and courier services and burner accounts. The betrayal burned not only because Henry had planned it, but because someone like Marcus, young, poor, trusting, had been turned into a lever. He thought of the quiet on Michael's floor above, the small house drawn on a page. In one motion, Richard made a decision. He would not let this end here. He would find Marcus, and he would tell him the truth. He would find the men Henry had hired and the path the money had taken. Whatever the cost, he would protect the boy who had steadied his son on a plane. The first twist had broken the map. Where they would go next, Richard did not yet know. He only knew the shape of the betrayal and that it had changed everything. Richard's life narrowed to a sharp, burning line of decisions. The betrayal had stripped the warm lacquer from his world and left raw grain underneath. Every call felt like an accusation. Every knock at the door sounded like an arrival of trouble. He moved through rooms that had once felt safe and now felt staged, like a set where the next scene might explode. He started with small things. He changed passwords, locked drawers, went through bank statements until numbers blurred into one another. At the same time, he set people to work, people who could make whispers die and rewrite how the day looked. Laura built a careful message that thanked supporters for concern and asked the press to respect the family's privacy. It was the right language. It was also brittle. The media smelled stories like hounds. No statement could keep attention from stretching to fit a narrative. Henry kept calling. His voice on the phone was smooth, apologetic when it needed to be, blunt when it served a purpose. "You have to see this as a wake-up," he said one afternoon. "We can use it, Richard. We can control how it looks, spin it into sympathy." Richard felt bile rise at the suggestion that he could spin his son's fear into advantage. He hated himself a little for thinking about optics at all. He had always measured danger as a loss of control. Now he saw that control itself could be the weapon. Marcus was the hardest contradiction. Richard wanted to find him and thank him and pay him and protect him, and he also wanted to make the photograph disappear without the boy knowing he had been used. He pictured Marcus back in his small shop, fingers stained with city dust, answering an old phone while serving customers. He imagined the boy looking over his shoulder as men in suits approached, eyes wary. Michael had been steadied by a hand that had no power in the world that Richard commanded, that made the hand sacred and fragile at the same time. Laura tracked Marcus down the way she tracked other things, through quiet channels, careful questions, a network of people who owed small favors. She found him in a place that smelled of fried food and phone screens, rinsing a counter when she walked in. Marcus blinked when she introduced herself, polite and cautious. He had not understood the weight of the photograph. He shrugged, as if to say he had only done what felt right. When Richard met him, he felt both gratitude and a strange, misplaced anger. He wanted to hug Marcus and tell him everything would be all right. Instead, he offered a hand that trembled slightly. "Thank you," he said. The words felt too small. Marcus looked at him with a kind of honest weariness and answered, "It's okay." He stopped. Marcus did not know to name the photograph as a problem. He did not know the currents swirling beneath the airport tiles. That ignorance made Richard ache. He wanted to protect Marcus from more than the public eye. He wanted to protect him from people like Henry, from men who thought they could move other lives like chess pieces. but he also felt the pull of his other life, the company, the investors, the sound of his own name in a room where it mattered. To guard one boy would be to risk the other things he had built. Inside the company, people began to shift. Board members who had always nodded in meetings started asking pointed questions. One called a private session to discuss reputation management. Another suggested a temporary sabbatical for Richard, a way to quiet public curiosity. The idea of stepping back made Richard dizzy. It would hand power to someone else, perhaps Henry. It would also admit that the man at the center of everything could be shaken. At night, he found himself awake, the corners of the house dark, the city's soft light leaking through curtains. Michael slept beside him and sometimes stirred, calling out a number, a list that reassured him. Richard would lie there and think of choices and how they shaded into one another. If he pressed too hard on Henry, would Henry retaliate? If he named Henry's involvement, would he fracture alliances the company needed? If he went public with the betrayal, would he expose Marcus to more danger? Every path forked into hard ground. Laura became a steady voice in the dark. She did not offer easy answers. She offered options like a surgeon offering incisions, necessary but costly. "We can go legal," she said one evening, hands folded on the table. "File a complaint, trace the payments, make an example. We can do it quietly," she added. "Settle with Marcus, pay for his schooling, keep it from the papers." Both options had their costs. The legal route would escalate things and make the photograph its own headline. The quiet route could be seen as buying silence, and it left open the question of who else had been involved. Richard sat with the dilemma like a man with two wounds. He thought of Michael's small house drawing and of the way Marcus's hand had steadied his son. He thought of Henry's thin apology, and the file slid across the desk like an offer to trade his life. The stakes were no longer abstract business decisions. They were moral shapes pressing into his chest. Meanwhile, Marcus felt pressure in different ways. Anna called him less often, hesitant now, as if she had noticed the risk. His mother started wearing the same dented ring to work, fingers worrying it into a habit. When men in suits showed up at the phone shop asking questions, softly at first, then bluntly, Marcus brushed them off with a laugh that did not reach his eyes. Someone offered him money and a quiet job. Someone else asked if he would testify about the day. Offers and threats braided together until he could not tell one from the other. The city seemed to watch too. Cafes emptied when Richard entered. Headlines whispered even when no paper printed them. The photograph became a ghost larger than its size, haunting corridors and elevator lobbies. People in both men's lives reacted in ways that revealed their true colors. Laura grew more protective, covering moves with care. Henry grew impatient, pushing for decisions that could be decisive and dangerous. Anna grew frightened for her brother and angrier at the thought of men who use people. As tension rose, Richard began to act in ways that surprised him. He stopped deferring and started to dig. He met with lawyers and with people who understood money trails. He spent long hours with lists, with contacts, with the quiet detective work he had once considered beneath him. He began to see Henry's maneuver as not just a business play, but as something personal, an attempt to reshape his life into a form Henry could manage. That realization made him angrier than fear. The first fistfight came in the form of an argument, short, sharp, in a private boardroom where Henry had tried to steer a conversation about a strategic pause for Richard. Henry's calm face snapped, and he called Richard reckless and sentimental. Richard answered with a word that landed harder than he expected: betrayal. Henry's jaw tightened, and the room filled with a silence that felt like a held breath. In that silence, Richard understood something he could not unsee. The enemy wearing the face of a friend sat across from him. Outside, Michael began to ask different questions. He asked if boys could be friends, even if their houses were different. He asked why people got angry, and if anger could be fixed with numbers. The simplicity of the questions struck Richard more sharply than any headline. They forced him back to the center of what mattered. He could fight the boards and the lawyers and the schemes, but there was only one moral point that would not bend: his child's trust. The choices pressed in on him like a tightening band. He had to decide whether to fight publicly and risk everything, or to move quietly and risk the moral cost of compromising with those who had turned lives into tactics. Either path required him to face Henry, to name what had been done, and to accept the consequences. The tension was no longer external alone. It had settled into his bones, a slow burning pressure that would not ease until a decision moved through it and something new took shape. The boardroom looked like a stage. Long table, bright lights, faces half hidden in shadow. Outside the tall windows, the city was a smear of glass and evening. Inside, every eye felt like a lens. Richard stood at the head of the table. He had asked for this meeting 2 hours earlier, with a voice that did not show the storm he carried. Now the storm had a name. Henry sat near the center, the same neat suit, the same small smile. He had expected allies. He had expected the room to tilt toward him once he began to speak. Instead, he watched people turn toward Richard the way leaves turn toward sudden light. Laura was by Richard's side, her expression hard and steady. Marcus and Anna sat where guests sometimes sit, in that small row usually reserved for outsiders. Their hands were linked. Marcus's jaw was set. Anna's mouth trembled, but her eyes were fierce. Michael sat in the doorway, clutching his notebook close to his chest. He had not wanted to come. Richard had brought him anyway, because the truth could not be delivered in secret. Richard began not with blame, but with the photograph. He held it up so everyone could see the Polaroid, the flat, grainy picture of a small hand resting near a boy who had been terrified. For a pulse, the room was silent enough that the hum of the building sounded like air moving through a flute. "This is not an accident," Richard said. His voice was low and clear. He did not shout. He did not need to. This was set up. A payment was made. A courier delivered it. Henry's fingers pressed at the table. His eyes flicked to the glass, where his reflection looked smaller than he had expected to be. Laura clicked a remote, and the screen behind them lit with a line of emails and numbers. The wire transfers were there, the courier receipts, the burner account. The evidence was plain and small and terrible because it showed the invisible hands. Henry opened his mouth. He tried to stitch a smile of reason. "It was a wake-up," he said. "You were drifting, Richard. I did what I thought was best." "You used my son," Richard replied. "You used a child to make me move where you wanted me to." The words were simple, which made them sharp. Henry's face did not change much. "I meant to force a choice for the good of the company." "For the good of the company?" Marcus's voice cut like a blade. He stood up. "You used me. You paid people to lie. You sent a photo and a note that read like a threat." The room shifted. Henry's plan had not accounted for the people he had used standing and naming him. He had expected fear and bargaining, not a boy with dusty hands and a clear, angry voice. "Marcus," Henry said, reaching for calm, "you don't understand the consequences. This is business." "I understand the consequences," Marcus said. "I know what it is to be used because I have been used a lot. My brother," he paused because Anna squeezed his hand. "My sister and my mother work hard. I never wanted to be part of something that hurts a child. I just helped because it felt right." Anna then stood, holding a small paper. "I work at a courier desk," she said. "I found this receipt after the photo was delivered. The courier's van had a logo. I traced it to a drop point. I kept the slip because something about it felt wrong. When Laura reached out to us, I brought it." She put the paper on the table. It had a stamp time and a code. Laura had already matched the code to the courier manifest. The paper was small and ordinary, but it burned bright in the room because ordinary facts had become truth. Henry's shoulders tightened as the proof closed like a trap. He looked at Richard as if pleading for a word he did not know how to say. Richard did not look at him. He looked at the board members, at the lawyers, at people who had nodded at Henry for years. He felt something in him that was no longer purely anger, but a cold weight of disappointment. "You made choices in my name and for your gain," he said. "You gambled with children and with my life." A long silence followed. The air seemed to hold its breath. Then one of the senior board members, a woman named Claire, leaned forward. She had been one of the few who had not smiled at Henry's jokes in meetings. "If this is true," she said carefully, then we are looking at a criminal act and a moral failure. Henry, would you like to explain why you thought this was acceptable? Henry's defense came raw and quick. He tried to sharpen the narrative. Richard had been drifting, he was saving the company, the ends justified the means. He spoke of investors and instability, and the danger of a leader who did not see the board's advice. His voice had the practiced texture of a man used to selling hard truths. Richard's next move was quieter than the first. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a thin report, emails that connected Henry to Marlowe Holdings, to a plan far larger than the Polaroid. Henry had been promising a merger that would give Marlowe controlling interest, but the documents showed something worse. Henry had been in touch with a man known for hostile takeovers, someone who had encouraged risky moves to unsettle leadership. The plan had been to make Richard appear distracted, to manufacture a crisis, and then present Henry as the steady hand to take over. The room reacted to that like thunder. Friends became faced with questions. Henry's mouth went thin. "You used blackmail tactics to make the company yours," Richard said. "You thought you could sacrifice a man's family to secure a deal." Henry's face finally broke. The small defenses fell and left something raw and human. "We were drowning," he whispered, a thin confession. "Investors wanted more. I thought if I made you move, you would accept help. I didn't want to see it all fall apart." "You lied," Laura said simply. "You lied and you used a child." The legal counsel rose then and began to speak in terms of procedure: suspension pending investigation, a board vote, criminal referrals. The air moved with the heavy machinery of consequence. It should have been the end of Henry in that room. But then the second twist struck, a truth that blurred the edges of simple vengeance and mercy. Henry had not acted entirely alone. The man from Marlowe, whose name the documents carried, had been pressuring Henry for months. He had called with ultimatums and threats. If Henry did not force a move, the company would be emptied for parts. Henry had believed he was protecting a larger number of people by acting decisively. His betrayal was not purely greed. It was mingled with fear and the feeling of being cornered. Richard felt the change in the room when that fact landed. It did not excuse Henry. It complicated him. A man who had broken trust had also been broken by pressure. The moral clarity he had wanted shifted into a harder question: how to punish without flattening everyone involved, how to protect the innocent, how to hold accountable the guilty. Michael stood then, stepping forward slowly and small, his notebook clutched. "My father made a bad choice," he said in a voice that cut through the talk. "But people make bad choices sometimes. They can learn. They can say sorry." The sentence loosened something tight in Richard's chest. He had come to the meeting to protect his son and to punish the betrayer. But standing there, hearing his son, so young and simple and brave, he realized justice could also be a learning shape. He saw Henry not as a monster, but as a friend who had broken badly. Richard looked at Henry, at the man who had shared cocktails and late-night plans, who had once been a brother. He also thought of Marcus and Anna, of a family that scraped and worked, of himself and the cost of power. He had to choose the right course now. He did not offer forgiveness as a cheap fix. He did not let Henry walk free. He proposed a path. Henry would be suspended, investigated, and if found criminally culpable, prosecuted. He would step down from any leadership position pending the inquiry. At the same time, Richard would use company resources to fund Marcus's schooling and support his family, and to create a fund for children affected by corporate misuses. He would also open company gates to a proper investigation into Marlowe's pressure. The board murmured. Some called it mercy, others called it smart politics. Henry's face crumpled into something like shame and relief all at once. Marcus and Anna wept quietly, not of joy, but of the heavy settling of danger into a new shape. Laura breathed out, tired and tight-lipped. Michael pressed the tiny house, drawing to his chest as if it were an anchor. The meeting disbanded slowly. Outside, the city had shed its evening coat and was dressing at night. People left with different things in their pockets, the sense of a future restored, perhaps, and the memory of how brittle power could be. At home, that night, Richard sat at his kitchen table with Michael asleep upstairs and Laura gone to rest. He felt raw and tired in a way that had nothing to do with business. He had faced betrayal and exposed it. He had chosen consequences and helped the ones who had been used. He had not solved everything. The fight with Marlowe would continue. The legal inquiries would be long. But the small, crucial thing had been done. Marcus and his family were safe for now, and Henry would answer to what he had done. Richard pressed his hand to the photograph one last time before sliding it into a drawer. The paper felt like a shard of a broken promise. He did not know whether the choice he had made would be praised or cursed. He only knew the small human fact that lay under all the deals. People hurt, and people could also be mended, but only if someone chose to hold both truth and mercy at once. By the time spring light thawed the city, things had settled into a new shape that felt steadier and more honest. The uproar from the photograph had dimmed into records and reports. Newspapers still mentioned the affair, but the fierce edge had softened. Richard moved through the days with a different kind of weight. It was not the weight of secrets and careful omissions. It was the weight of choices he had made and had to live with. Marcus went back to his shop, but the shop had changed. There was a small scholarship fund set up in his name, and a contractor had repaired the leaky ceiling at his mother's home. Anna started an evening class that would help her get a stable job. They still wiped their hands on the same clothes and stood at the counter when customers asked for help, but there was a new light in their house. Marcus kept his soft, cautious smile, but it had a new line around it now, less surprise when goodness arrived, more expectation that life might sometimes give a return. Henry had resigned from his formal roles and faced an inquiry. He went through public hearings that stripped away the veneer he had used for years. People watched him and cataloged his words. Some forgave him. Some called him cruel. He lost influence and, for a while, slept. The man who had once made decisions from the top of the table now had to answer for the cost of those decisions. There were days when Richard thought of him as a broken tool, and other days when he felt pity for a man who had been scared into making wrong choices. Richard changed, too. The felt-sharp corners of his world had been sanded. He still measured things by results, but he had learned to measure also by the faces those results touched. He spent mornings with Michael more often, sitting at the kitchen table while the boy drew the same house until the lines were smooth and familiar. He learned how to make tea the way Michael liked, slightly warm and in a favorite mug. He learned to slow down and listen when Michael cataloged the world in his small, exact way. It was not a cure for everything. Nothing erased what Michael had felt in that cabin of the plane, but it built a steadiness between them that money never could. There were harder lessons. Richard found himself thinking about the ledger of favors and debts he had kept without naming them as such for so many years. He had once believed that money could fix the raw edges of life, that influence could shape the world into a safer place. Now, he saw that influence could also be a blunt instrument and that power handled without care could cut. He began to meet with people in the company differently, less with an eye for the bottom line and more with questions about human cost. He instituted a board committee focused on ethics and community impact, not because it would make headlines, but because he wanted the company to have a place that asked whether their moves helped the people they touched. One evening, when the city had gone quiet and the kitchen light was the only lamp on, Richard found Henry on the back steps of the estate. Henry had come looking for a conversation that was not staged or guarded. They sat in silence for a while, watching a cracked moon move through a thin cloud. "I lost myself," Henry said, finally, voice small. "I thought the company was everything. I thought saving it justified everything." Richard looked at him and felt no sudden forgiveness rush in. He felt tired and older and grateful for the clarity that had come from pain. "You broke lines," he said simply. "You made choices that hurt people. That cannot stand. But I do not want to burn a life for the sake of retribution. Live with the cost, Henry. Make it right where you can." Henry nodded, and for the first time Richard saw the man he had once trusted, worn, ashamed, human. The acknowledgement would not clear the slate, but it began to shift the geometry of their relationship into something truer. There were quiet moments, too, that felt like small salvations. Michael taught Richard to fold paper into tiny houses matching the ones he drew. They folded cranes and little boats, and sometimes a cat with lopsided ears. The act was simple, absurd perhaps for a man who had lived in boardrooms, but it was a way to be present. When Michael asked why Richard sometimes looked sad, Richard told the truth in a way a child could hold. I did not protect you the way I should have at first. I am learning. I will try to do better. Marcus came to the fund opening for children affected by corporate misuse. He wore a clean shirt and spoke a few short words into a small microphone. He did not speak of the photograph or the moment on the plane. He spoke about work, about community, and about how small acts could change days. The audience listened in a way that felt more than polite. Marcus's voice was steady. It carried a dignity that money rarely bought. There were nights when Richard replayed choices and felt guilty for the parts he had allowed himself to ignore for convenience. He thought of the ledger he had kept of favors and realized that some of those favors had been bought at the cost of other people's dignity. He vowed to change the accounting in his head, not to count only what came into his bank, but also what he owed in human terms. He instituted support for families like Marcus's, but he also began to visit schools and community centers, not with checkbooks, but with a willingness to listen. The moral work was heavy. Richard often found himself asking whether mercy and justice could coexist without one diluting the other. He had chosen a middle path in the boardroom. The company would hold Henry accountable, and Marcus's family would be supported. That path pleased some and angered others. It also meant living with ambiguity and the knowledge that no single decision would set the world right. He had to accept that some things were messy and that life demanded neither perfect vengeance nor blind forgiveness, but a careful reckoning. In the months that followed, people began to return to ordinary concerns. The company steadied, investors stayed, moved, or left in waves. Marcus studied in the evenings and learned a trade that would carry him forward. Anna finished her course and found a job with steady hours. Michael grew taller and more willing to test new things, and Richard found himself cheering the small experiments as loudly as any business victory. At a small dinner one spring, Richard raised a glass to those who had helped, not as a speech, but as a quiet nod to the people who had kept the truth alive. Marcus clinked his glass, Anna laughed, and Henry sat quietly, looking older and leaner in a way that spoke of cost. Michael rested his head on Richard's shoulder and drew a tiny house on a napkin, 3 small windows, precise and patient. Richard watched the house and felt the shape of his life change. He had not been absolved by any single act. He had been taught by loss and by love. The betrayal had broken him open, but what grew from that break was a capacity to listen and to act with humility. He had chosen to protect the small and the vulnerable, to use his power to build rather than to control. The lesson was hard and slow. It would take years. He did not know if the world would remember the photograph or the hearings in 10 years. He did not live for that memory. He lived for the quiet scenes. A boy folding paper, a sister studying late, a man who had once been tempted to swap other lives for power learning to be small and sorry. Those were the things that mattered. On a cool morning, walking his son to a small park, Richard watched Michael run to a swing and laugh. The sound was clear and simple and true. Richard felt a peace that was not perfect, but earned. He had been forced to choose between preserving his image and preserving his child's safety. He had chosen the child. He had then chosen to confront the betrayal without letting bitterness harden him beyond repair. It was, he knew, an imperfect form of justice, but it was one that kept the most important thing intact: human life, with its fragility and its stubborn capacity to heal. If you found this story powerful, make sure to hit that like button, share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more videos like this. Your support helps us bring more important stories to light.